Snow was falling hard that Christmas Eve, the kind that silences everything. In the hills above Snowhaven, a single house still had its lights on. Inside, Colonel Henry Cole stood by the window, a glass of bourbon in his hand, watching the world he no longer felt part of. The fireplace burned low. The dog, a German shepherd named Rex, lay near the hearth, half asleep, half listening. Henry had spent 35 years commanding men, surviving wars, building wars around his heart. He had medals on his shelf, memories in his scars, and no one left to share either with. He told himself he didn't mind the quiet, that the silence was better than pretending. But as midnight drew near, and the church bells echoed faintly through the snow, something in him ached, that old ache he could never quite drink away. Then, out of nowhere, came a sound he hadn't heard in years. A soft, hesitant knock on the front door. Rex lifted his head. Henry froze. And for the first time in a very long time, he wondered what if this Christmas wasn't meant to be silent after all. Snowhaven, Vermont, a postcard town tucked between white hills and frozen pines, the kind of place where Christmas looked perfect from the outside. Every house along Maple Ridge Lane glowed with strings of gold and red. Laughter drifted out of windows, soft carols mixed with the wind, and the faint peal of church bells echoed through the valley. But up on the hill, where the road curved toward the forest, stood a house that looked like it belonged in another world. Tall, elegant, and utterly still. That was where Colonel Henry Cole lived, or, more accurately, where he existed. The colonel had retired 10 years earlier. After 35 years in the United States Army, he'd commanded men through deserts, jungles, and bombed out streets most Americans would never see. He'd buried friends, lost soldiers, and worn silence like armor. Now, at 65, he lived in a house big enough for a family, but filled only with the echoes of memory. Inside, everything was precise. The furniture aligned, the mantel polished, the firewood stacked in perfect symmetry, as if he were still in uniform and life demanded inspection every morning. Even the Christmas tree, 12 feet tall, crowned with a brass star, looked like something from a magazine, every ornament placed with care, every light evenly spaced, but there were no presents beneath it. No ribbons, no tags with names, just a reflection of the tree's lights on polished hardwood floors. Henry stood by the tall window that overlooked the town. He wore a thick wool sweater, dark slacks, and the same silver watch he'd worn through half his life. In one hand he held a glass of bourbon, not for celebration, but for company. Outside, snow fell in slow, deliberate sheets, turning the night into something soft and distant. Rex, the German shepherd, lay stretched out by the fireplace. His fur caught the orange glow of the flames, and his ears twitched at every gust of wind outside. The dog had served once, like his master, trained for search and rescue, loyal, disciplined. Now he was older, slower, but still alert to every flicker of emotion that crossed the colonel's face. Henry turned from the window and looked at Rex. "You and me again, boy," he murmured, voice low and hoarse. "Another Christmas." Rex lifted his head, thumped his tail once on the rug, and let out a small breath through his nose, a sigh that sounded almost human. Henry smiled faintly, though it didn't reach his eyes. He walked toward the fireplace, sat down in the armchair that had molded to his shape over the years, and placed the glass on the table beside him. The room creaked softly as the fire shifted. He could hear the faint ticking of the clock in the hallway, steady, merciless outside. The laughter from the town sounded like it came from another planet. He'd told himself he liked it this way. The quiet, the control, the absence of surprises. After all, he'd spent decades surrounded by chaos, by men screaming orders and mortar whistling through the air. The silence was supposed to be peace. But tonight, as the snow thickened and the church bells faded, the quiet felt heavier, like a weight pressing on his chest. On the mantel stood a small framed photo, his wife Margaret, smiling in a sundress, standing beside their son Daniel. The boy had been maybe 10 in that picture. Henry had meant to call him last Christmas, then he'd waited too long, as he always did. The phone call never happened. He reached out and straightened the frame, a small habitual gesture, then drew his hand back quickly, as if the glass had burned him. The past always did. Rex stirred, padding over to rest his head against Henry's knee. The old man reached down, scratched behind the dog's ear, and whispered, "Guess it's just us now." The dog's eyes lifted, calm and loyal. There was no judgment in them, no pity, just quiet understanding. It made Henry look away. He stood, crossed the room, and turned off the lamp near the tree. The room fell into half-darkness, the only light coming from the fire and the blinking star on the tree's top. The faint scent of pine filled the air, clean, sharp, almost like the forests he used to march through long ago. He caught his own reflection in the window, tall, straight-backed despite his age, with gray hair cut too neatly and eyes that still scanned every shadow. Old habits, the kind that never left a soldier. For a moment, he imagined what the house would sound like if someone were here, a child's laughter, the shuffle of wrapping paper, maybe music from an old radio. He could almost hear it, the ghosts of something he once knew. But the sound faded before it could take shape. He took another sip of bourbon, savoring its burn. Outside, the snow kept falling, blurring the lights of the town below. From the corner of the room, Rex lifted his head again and gave a low, uneasy bark. One, then two. Henry frowned. Easy, he said softly. Nothing out there. The dog went quiet but didn't settle. For a long moment, the colonel listened. The wind, the fire, the ticking clock, nothing else. He sat back down, feeling the house close around him like an old, familiar shell. Christmas Eve, another one. The town below celebrated, sang, embraced. And up here on the hill, a soldier waited for nothing in particular, and yet for something he couldn't quite name. When he finally rose to refill his glass, the tree's reflection caught his eye again. The brass stars shimmered faintly in the firelight, a single, trembling glow in a room full of quiet. He didn't know it yet, but this would be the last Christmas he'd ever spend alone. Morning came softly over Snowhaven. Light filtered through the frost-covered windows, spilling gold across the living room. Henry Cole sat where he'd fallen asleep in the same armchair beside the fireplace, with an empty glass and Rex curled close to his feet. The fire had burned down to embers, and the house was cold again. He rubbed his eyes, adjusted his glasses, and let the quiet settle. Mornings were always the hardest. The stillness pressed closer, louder than any battlefield he'd ever known. He told himself he liked it, that solitude was a kind of freedom. But every now and then, when the snow melted just right and the air carried the faint smell of pine and wood smoke, memories slipped through. Henry once had everything a man could want. Margaret, Daniel, a wife and a son who had waited for him through the years, through deployments that stretched longer than promises were meant to last. He could still picture them clearly. Margaret in her blue sweater, her hair tucked behind one ear, always humming when she cooked. She used to fill the house with life, plants by the windows, music on Sunday mornings, the smell of cinnamon and soap. She laughed easily back then, before the years changed him. Daniel was the image of her, curious, restless, always asking questions. When Henry came home on leave, the boy would run to him full speed, arms out, shouting, "Dad," like it was the only word that mattered. For a time, it almost felt like he could balance both worlds, the soldier and the father. But the wars never really ended for him. They just changed scenery. Each time he returned, he brought something invisible back with him, a silence, a hardness, a way of looking through people instead of at them. Margaret tried to reach him. She used to wait at the kitchen table long after he'd gone upstairs, just to talk. Sometimes he'd find her asleep there in the morning, her hand still resting on a cold cup of tea. He wanted to tell her he was sorry. He wanted to tell her that the things he'd seen stayed with him in ways words couldn't touch. But he didn't. He just stayed quiet, the same way he'd learned to survive out there. Years passed. Daniel grew into a teenager who stopped asking questions. He stopped running to the door when Henry came home. The laughter faded, replaced by the careful politeness people use when they've given up trying. And then one winter, Margaret packed her car. No shouting, no tears, just a note on the kitchen counter that said, "You need peace, Henry, but so do we." He found it after returning from a base inspection. Rex, younger then, had been the one to lead him to the door, whining softly as if he already knew. Henry had stood in that empty kitchen for hours, the refrigerator humming, the clock ticking. He didn't call her, didn't try to stop them. Maybe he should have. Maybe he wanted to. But all he said, quietly to himself, was, "She's right. They deserve better than this." So he retired, sold their old house in Maryland and bought this place, a sprawling cabin that overlooked Snowhaven's forests. A quiet life, he told the realtor. That's all I'm after. The first few months, the silence felt like a relief. No orders to give, no noise, no expectations. He built a routine. Early coffee, long walks with Rex, the paper at noon, bourbon by the fire. The town folks called him Colonel out of habit and respect. But they never pried. They waved from a distance and let him keep his distance too. It was exactly what he thought he wanted, until he realized quiet has a way of turning on you. When it lasts too long, it starts whispering back. By the third winter, he caught himself talking to Rex more often. At first, just simple words, "Come, stay, good boy." But over time, it became full conversations. Fragments of things he used to say to Margaret, to Daniel. He'd sit by the window with a cup of coffee, watching the snow fall, and say things like, Your mother would have liked this one, Daniel. Not too cold, just enough to stick. The dog would tilt his head, listening like he understood. Maybe he did. Every December, Henry still put up the tree. It was always the same, the big one from the corner lot in town, trimmed to perfection. He kept the same brass star Margaret once bought, polished it until it shone. The ritual gave him something to do, something to hold on to. And each Christmas Eve, when the lights were all strung and the fire burned bright, he'd sit near the phone, not expectantly, just in case. He told himself Daniel was busy, maybe overseas, maybe with a family of his own. He didn't want to intrude, didn't want to make things harder. Still, every time the phone rang, a telemarketer or a wrong number, the pharmacy, his heart lifted before logic caught up. It had been 9 Christmases since the last real call, but he kept the same number, just in case his son ever remembered it. Rex stirred now, stretching his legs by the fire. The morning light caught the gray in his muzzle, the same gray that now streaked Henry's hair. They'd aged together, quietly, loyally. Henry stood, poured himself another cup of coffee, and stared at the photo on the mantel again. Margaret and Daniel, a frozen memory of summer sunlight on their faces, hope still in their eyes. He wondered what they'd think of him now, a man surrounded by everything money could buy, and haunted by everything it couldn't fix. Sometimes, when the wind was right, he could almost hear Margaret's voice, soft, "We're forgiving," saying his name the way only she used to. Other times, he imagined Daniel as a man, maybe with kids of his own, maybe telling them stories about a father who loved his country too much to love anything else properly. The thought hurt, but he didn't push it away. He didn't push anything away anymore. The walls he'd built were still there. They just didn't protect him like they used to. He glanced toward the window, the world outside blinding white. Snowhaven was waking up, church bells ringing again, children laughing in the street. And inside the grand old house on the hill, a retired soldier stood in his perfect silence, remembering the family he'd once called home. The wind howled like something alive that night. Snow swept hard across the pines, rattling against the windows of the old house on the hill. It was the kind of cold that crept under doors, the kind that made the whole world hold its breath. Inside, Colonel Henry Cole poured kibble into Rex's bowl. The dog thumped his tail once, grateful as always, before settling to eat. The fire cracked low behind them, throwing amber light across the polished wood floors. Henry checked the clock, almost 9. He'd already eaten leftover stew, a glass of bourbon, the same as every Christmas Eve. Routine kept the nights from swallowing him whole. He was rinsing the bowl in the sink when it happened. Knock knock, a soft, uncertain sound at first, so faint he thought he imagined it. Then it came again, 3 gentle taps, hesitant, as if whoever stood outside wasn't sure they should be there. Rex's head shot up. He gave a low, questioning woof. Henry frowned, setting down the dish towel. No one ever came up this road, not this late, not in a storm like this. He crossed the living room, his boots quiet on the rug, and opened the front door. The wind rushed in first, carrying a swirl of snow and the smell of pine. And there, framed against the white, which stood a woman and a boy. The woman was in her early 30s, cheeks flushed red from the cold. She wore a long wool coat and a knitted hat pulled low over her ears. In her arms, she held a small box wrapped in paper and string. Beside her, the boy, maybe 9, stood shivering, clutching the woman's sleeve, his nose pink, his eyes wide. "Evening," Henry said, his voice rough with surprise. The woman smiled quickly, a little breathless. "Good evening, sir. I'm sorry to bother you so late. We live just down the road, moved in last week, actually." She hesitated, then held up the box. "I'm Laura Bennett. This is my son Noah. We've baked some gingerbread cookies and wanted to drop some off for the neighbors." Neighbors? Henry almost smiled at the word. He hadn't thought of himself as anyone's neighbor in years. "That's kind of you," he said, unsure what else to say. "You shouldn't be out in weather like this." Laura gave a small laugh. "I told him that, but he insisted. Said we couldn't skip the last house on the street." The boy peeked up at him then, eyes catching on Rex, who stood just behind Henry, tail swaying slowly. "Whoa," the boy breathed. "He's huge." Henry glanced down at the dog, then back at the boy. "German Shepherd, name's Rex, retired like me." Noah crouched a little, holding out a hand. "Hey, buddy." Rex sniffed him once, then without hesitation leaned forward, pressing his head against the boy's glove. The child's laughter broke out instantly, bright and clear, bouncing off the quiet walls behind Henry. "He's gentle," Noah said, beaming up at his mother. Henry felt something shift in the room's still air of warmth. Fragile but real. He cleared his throat. "You're letting the heat out. Come in, before you both freeze." Laura blinked, surprised, but smiled gratefully. "Are you sure? We don't want to intrude." "It's fine," he said, stepping back. "The tea's hot." They entered cautiously, brushing snow from their coats. The scent of winter and sugar followed them in. Henry closed the door behind them, and for the first time in years, the sound of laughter, not from a TV, not from memory, filled the house. He motioned toward the fire. "Warm yourselves. I'll get some tea." While he filled the kettle, he could hear Noah talking softly to Rex, asking about the medals on his collar, about whether he'd been a real army dog. The tone in the boy's voice, earnest, curious, pulled at something deep in Henry's chest. When he returned with steaming mugs, Laura had taken off her hat, her hair falling loose around her shoulders. She looked tired in a way he recognized, not from work or weather, but from life itself. "Thank you," she said, wrapping her hands around the cup. "We've been unpacking all week. The heat's still unreliable." "So this is heaven." Henry nodded. "You said you just moved here." She smiled. "Yeah, from Albany. I work remote now, so I thought a quieter town might be good for both of us." She glanced at Noah. "City life isn't always kind to kids." Henry looked at the boy, who was still talking softly to Rex, now lying on his side, tail thumping lazily. "Seems like he's adjusting fine," Henry said. Laura laughed quietly. "He's braver with animals than people." For a few moments, no one spoke. The storm outside raged against the windows, but inside, the fire popped, the tea steamed, and the old house didn't feel quite so empty. Henry found himself saying, almost absently, "You picked a good town. Snowhaven's peaceful. Folks mostly keep to themselves. Sometimes that's what people need." Laura said softly, "A little peace." He nodded slowly, the words hitting closer than she could know. Noah broke the silence with a grin. "Mr. Cole, did you and Rex really work in the army?" Henry blinked. "How'd you know my name?" "Mailbox," Noah said, matter of fact. "And Mom said you walk like someone who used to shout orders." Laura groaned. "Noah," but Henry chuckled, an honest, low laugh that startled even him. "You're not wrong, son. 35 years worth." The boy's eyes went wide. "Wow. Did Rex save you in the war?" Henry looked down at the dog, whose eyes met his calmly, almost knowingly. "More times than I can count." For a moment, the fire's light caught on the metals by the mantel, shining faintly. Laura followed his gaze, then looked back at him with a softness that didn't feel like pity, but understanding. They stayed another half-hour talking about small things. Snowhaven's market, the best sledding hill, the bakery that sold cinnamon rolls the size of fists. When they finally stood to leave, Noah knelt to hug Rex goodbye. "See you, buddy," he whispered. Rex licked his glove once, as if in answer. Laura smiled. "Thank you again for the tea, Colonel. And for letting us in." "Just Henry," he said quietly, "and you're welcome any time." She nodded, eyes warm. "Merry Christmas, Henry." When the door closed behind them, Henry stood for a long moment, listening to the echo of their voices fade down the snowy path. Rex came to sit beside him, tail brushing his leg. Henry reached down, scratching behind the dog's ear. "Well," he murmured, half to himself, "looks like Christmas came knocking after all." Outside, the storm kept falling, but inside the old house, for the first time in years, the fire burned brighter. The next Christmas came quietly, as they all did. Snowhaven was buried under another heavy blanket of white, the air sharp enough to turn every breath into mist. The streets glowed gold under garlands and lights, but up on the hill, Henry Cole's house remained mostly dark save for the soft shimmer of the tree inside. He'd trimmed it 2 days earlier, same as every year, out of habit more than holiday spirit, but this time, he'd left one extra cup and saucer on the shelf. He didn't admit why, not even to himself, though Rex seemed to know. By the time the clock neared 8, the dog had already positioned himself near the door, tail twitching, eyes trained on the dark window. Henry laughed quietly. "Don't get your hopes up, old boy. People move on." But Rex didn't move. He waited, and then, as if summoned by faith alone, there it was, that soft knock again. Henry froze, mid-sip, heart lurching. Rex barked once, sharp and eager. When Henry opened the door, snowflakes drifted in with the wind, and there they were again, Laura Bennett and her son Noah, both dusted in white, both smiling as though the night itself had been waiting for them. "Merry Christmas, Colonel," Laura said, cheeks flushed from the cold. "We brought some company again." Noah lifted a small box tied with red ribbon. "Mom made more gingerbread. I helped this time." Henry blinked, taken off guard. "You came back." Laura laughed softly. "Of course. We thought you might be lonely." She handed him a small envelope, a simple white card with crooked handwriting that read, "To Henry and Rex, Merry Christmas from your neighbors." For a long moment, Henry said nothing. The world outside howled with wind, but something warmer stirred inside his chest. Finally, he stepped aside. "Come in, tea's still hot." That night, the house glowed again, fire crackling, mugs steaming. Rex sprawled lazily by Noah's feet. The boy was taller now, a little more talkative, full of stories about school, sledding, and the snow fort he'd built down the hill. Laura listened with that same patient smile, her eyes soft whenever she looked at her son. Henry caught himself watching her sometimes, the calm strength she carried, the quiet gratitude she gave for the smallest things. It reminded him of Margaret, in ways both comforting and painful. When they left, Laura thanked him again. "We'll see you next year," she asked. Henry hesitated, the words catching somewhere between pride and hope. "I suppose I'll have the tea ready," he said at last. And so, it began, a quiet tradition, built on nothing more than kindness and a knock on the door. Each December they came. Sometimes the snow was heavy, sometimes it barely dusted the ground, but they always arrived the same way. Laura with her soft knock, Noah with his shy grin, Rex already waiting by the door before Henry even heard them. Year by year, the ritual grew. Henry started baking shortbread badly, but sincerely. He'd complain about it to Rex while setting the tray to cool. "You'd think after commanding battalions I could manage a batch of cookies." Rex would just tilt his head, unimpressed, until the old man laughed and tossed him one anyway. He'd decorate the house earlier too, dusting off boxes he hadn't touched in years, ornaments from a life before the silence. Some nights, he caught himself humming softly while he worked. The visits became his anchor, something to look forward to in a life that had long since stopped offering surprises. He never told them, of course he didn't need to. The anticipation spoke louder than words, the way he'd check the clock each Christmas Eve, or how he'd straighten his tie before they arrived. One winter, Laura brought a photograph. It showed the three of them, herself, Noah, and Henry standing in front of the tree, Rex sitting proudly at their feet. "We printed an extra," she said, handing it to him, "for your mantel." Henry stared at it for a long time after they left. The frame felt heavier than it should have, as if holding not just paper and ink, but proof that time could still give instead of only taking. He placed it beside the old photo of Margaret and Daniel. For the first time, the mantel didn't feel like a shrine to the past. It felt like a bridge to something living. As the years passed, Noah grew taller, his laughter deeper. He started bringing small gifts, a carved wooden dog, a snow globe from the market, a handmade card that read, "To Mr. Cole, from your Christmas friend." Henry started giving back, model planes, books about military dogs. One year, he even gave Noah a small compass, engraved with the words, "Always find your way home." Laura tried to protest, saying he didn't have to, but Henry just smiled. "I wanted to," he said. "You to remind me what Christmas used to feel like." Sometimes, when the night grew quiet and the candles burned low, Laura would look at him, at the man the town called Colonel, with both reverence and distance, and see something softer behind the formality. A man who had learned how to survive, but was only just remembering how to live. She told him once, half joking, "You're not as scary as you look." "You know," he smiled faintly, "don't ruin my reputation, Laura." They laughed, and the sound echoed warm against the frost-lined windows. Rex grew slower over time, his muzzle widening, his gait more careful, but come every December 24th he'd still plant himself by the door hours early. Waiting, his loyalty was unwavering, his instincts sharper than any clock. Henry often sat beside him, resting a hand on the old dog's back. "Don't worry," he'd whisper, "they'll come." And they always did, each year. Laura's knock felt less like a visit and more like a promise that no one is ever too far gone to be remembered, that even the loneliest house can hold laughter again. By the fifth Christmas, Henry realized he no longer dreaded the winter. He looked forward to it, to the sound of boots on snow, to the smell of cinnamon and pine, to the sight of two figures walking up the path through the falling white. Somewhere along the way, the waiting stopped being painful. It became hope. That Christmas Eve, as Noah and Rex dozed by the fire, Laura glanced across the room and said softly, "You know, Colonel, this little tradition of ours, it's kind of special." Henry met her gaze, smiling faintly. "It's more than special," he said. "It's what keeps this house warm." Outside, the snow kept falling, quiet and endless. Inside, three souls and one faithful dog sat bathed in firelight, held together by nothing more than kindness and everything that truly mattered. The storm had started early that year. By noon on Christmas Eve, Snowhaven was swallowed whole, roofs buried, streets hushed, the world outside reduced to white and whispering wind. Inside the old coal house, everything was ready. The fire glowed warm in the hearth. The tree shimmered with gold and silver, and two cups waited patiently on the coffee table beside a plate of shortbread. The smell of cinnamon and pine filled the air. Henry adjusted the cups once more, even though they didn't need adjusting. Old habits, maybe, or nerves. Rex sat near the door, tail thumping lazily against the rug, ears twitching every time the wind shifted. "Don't stop yet," Henry murmured, smiling faintly. "They'll be late. Weather's bad." He looked out the window. Snowflakes spiraled thick in the air, glowing orange under the street lamp. The world looked softer than it was, as if mercy could fall from the sky. He checked the clock. 7:30, then 8 o'clock, then 8:45. Each time he found a new excuse. Traffic's rough. Maybe they stopped to shovel the driveway. Noah probably insisted on wrapping one more gift. But the excuses thinned as the hours stretched. By 9:30 the tea had gone cold. By 10, even the fire seemed to burn quieter, as if holding its breath. Rex shifted, gave a low whine, and looked at Henry with those eyes deep, questioning. "Loyal." Henry forced a chuckle. "They'll come, old boy. They always do." But his voice broke a little on the last word. He stood by the window, watching as the snow thickened, erasing everything beyond the gate. The road that always carried them, the mother and son who had somehow become the center of his Decembers, was now just a blur of white silence. He waited until the clock struck midnight. When the last chime faded, Henry sighed, heavy and hollow. "Guess it's just us this year." He turned off the kettle, dimmed the lights, and stood at the doorway one last time. The wind cut sharp against his face. The steps were buried deep, untouched. No footprints, no promise of laughter. Rex sat beside him, head tilted, snow catching on his muzzle. For the first time in years, the house behind them felt cold again. Christmas morning dawned gray. Henry hadn't slept. He sat in his armchair, the old clock ticking like a heartbeat in the silence. Rex dozed at his feet, waking now and then to look toward the door, as if expecting a miracle. When the knock didn't come again, Henry sighed, rubbed his temples, and reached for his coat. He rarely left home anymore, not unless he had to. Crowds unsettled him, hospitals even more so, but something about the silence was unbearable this time. He stepped out into the snow. At the main gate of the neighborhood, he found Tom, the security guard, a young man who'd always nodded politely whenever Henry passed but never dared conversation. "Merry Christmas, Colonel," Tom greeted, a little startled to see him out in the cold. Henry nodded. "Evening," Tom said. "The Bennett family, Laura and a boy. Have you seen them tonight?" Tom's face shifted. "You didn't hear, sir? There was an accident last night. Nothing too serious. Thank God, just a car that slid off the road near the bridge. They're both at St. Mary's. Broken arm, some bruises. But they'll be fine." The words hit like a gust of wind. Relief came first, quick and fierce, followed by something else. Guilt, fear. Henry swallowed hard. "They're in the hospital?" "Yes, sir. Since last night." He stood there for a moment, staring down the road that led into town. The snow kept falling, piling on his boots, soft but relentless. He could have gone back home, told himself they'd recover, that there was nothing for him to do, but then he looked down at Rex, who was staring up with expectant eyes, tail wagging just once as if to say, "We know where we're needed." Henry exhaled. "We're going, boy." He buttoned his coat, pulled on his gloves. It's Christmas. The drive to St. Mary's felt longer than it was. The roads were slick, the snow thick against the windshield, but Henry's focus was steady, soldier's instinct kicking in. Hands firm, mind clear. Rex sat in the passenger seat, watching the lights blur past. When they reached the hospital, Henry hesitated at the entrance. He hadn't set foot in one since the army. Too many ghosts and white corridors, too much waiting, too many names that never came back. The door slid open with a mechanical sigh, warm air spilling out into the cold. He stepped inside. The lobby smelled faintly of disinfected and pine cleaner. A small tree stood in the corner, draped in tinsel. A nurse at the desk looked up, blinking at the tall man in the heavy coat with a German shepherd by his side. "Sir, I'm sorry animals aren't." Henry raised a hand gently. "Just for a minute. I'm looking for Laura Bennett. She and her son were in an accident." The nurse hesitated, then softened. Something in his tone, or maybe the way Rex sat quietly beside him, eyes calm and steady, told her this wasn't a man to turn away. "Room 214, she said quietly. "End of the hall." Henry nodded, murmured his thanks, and made his way down the corridor. The sounds of the hospital faded behind him, the hum of machines, the shuffle of slippers, the low murmur of nurses. Everything seemed distant except for his heartbeat. When he reached the room, the door was slightly ajar. Inside, Laura lay propped against her pillow, an IV in her arm, reading softly from a book. Noah sat beside her, one arm in a sling, face pale but smiling. Henry froze in the doorway. suddenly unsure if he should enter. But then Noah looked up and shouted, "Mr. Cole." Laura turned, eyes widening. "Henry, you came." He stepped in, hat in hand, snow still melting from his coat. Rex padded beside him, tail wagging slow and steady. "Couldn't let you two have Christmas without proper company," Henry said quietly. Laura's eyes shimmered. "You didn't have to, I did," he interrupted softly. "Because it's not Christmas without you." Rex went straight to Noah's bedside, pressing his head into the boy's good hand. Noah laughed, the sound fragile but bright. The nurse peeked in, saw the scene and smiled instead of scolding. For the first time in years, Henry felt the warmth of the world return to him, not through firelight or ornaments, but through presence, through courage, through love that expected nothing in return. He sat down, Rex curling at his feet, and for a long moment, they just breathed together, the soldier, the mother, the boy, and the dog. Outside, snow kept falling against the window, soft and unending, and somewhere deep inside Henry Cole's chest, a door long locked finally opened, not to the ghosts of his past, but to the life that still waited patiently for him to step back into it. St. Mary's Hospital was small, the kind of place that still smelled faintly of pine and floor wax, where nurses hummed under their breath to keep the silence from swallowing everything whole. That night, the halls glowed with soft yellow light. Someone down the corridor was playing Silent Night on a cheap radio, the melody weaving through the air like a memory that refused to fade. Henry walked slowly, the sound of his boots muted against the linoleum floor. He still wore his wool coat, snow melting in small dark patches on the shoulders. Rex trotted beside him, nails clicking faintly, tails sweeping low. When he reached room 214, he paused. His hand hovered over the doorknob, his heart heavy with something he hadn't felt in years, nervousness. He had faced mortifier, ambushes, and endless nights under foreign skies, but somehow, this walking into a room to see two people who had quietly become his family felt harder. He drew a slow breath and pushed the door open. The room was dim except for the glow of a bedside lamp. Laura was sitting up, a bandage wrapped around her shoulder, and for trailing from her arm. Noah sat on the edge of the bed in hospital pajamas, a sling holding his arm. When they both looked up, the stillness broke. "Colonel Henry." Noah's voice cracked through the quiet. His face lit up, brighter than the lights on any Christmas tree. "Hey there, soldier," Henry said, his voice rough but warm. Before he could say another word, Noah had already scrambled off the bed and wrapped his good arm around Rex's neck. The dog wagged his tail so hard his whole body shook, pressing close as if to say, "We found you, kid." Laura blinked back tears, her voice trembling. You came all the way here." Henry nodded, a small smile tugging at his mouth. "Couldn't lead you to celebrate Christmas alone in here." "You didn't have to." "Maybe I did," he interrupted softly. His gaze drifted between them, the boy, the mother, the soft glow of the lamp. "You two are the only reason I remembered what this day means." Laura's eyes shimmered, her lips parting as if to speak, but no words came. Instead, she reached for the box on the nightstand and slid it toward him. Inside were a few slightly crushed gingerbread cookies, tied with a red ribbon. "I saved these," she whispered. "We were going to bring them to you." Henry chuckled quietly, the sound low and genuine. "Looks like I beat you to it this year." He pulled up a chair, settling beside the bed. Rex lay down near Noah's feet, head resting on the boy's leg. The hospital seemed to fade around them, the machines, the whispers, even the storm outside. For a while, it was just them and the soft hum of Silent Night drifting through the hallway. Laura broke the silence first. "You drove in this weather. It must have been awful out there." Henry shrugged lightly. "I've been through worse storms," he said with a faint grin. "But this one felt worth it." Noah giggled, his cheeks flushed. "Rex kept me warm. Remember, last time we visited, he fell asleep on my feet." Henry smiled. "He's got good instincts. Always knows who needs him most." They talked for a long time about nothing and everything. About snow forts and sledding, about Laura's new job at the library, about the Christmas parade they'd missed this year. Henry told Noah a few old army stories, the funny ones, not the dark ones about tents that blew away in desert storms and a captain who once tried to cook a turkey with a flamethrower. Noah laughed so hard his sling slipped, and even Laura couldn't stop smiling. When the nurse came by, she frowned at the sight of Rex on the floor but said nothing. Instead, she smiled and whispered, "Merry Christmas." Before closing the door again, Henry reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small wrapped box. "I wasn't sure I'd get to give this to you," he said, handing it to Noah. The boy tore the paper open and gasped. Inside was a small model airplane, perfectly detailed. "It's a C-130 Hercules," Henry said softly. "The one I used to fly supplies with. Thought you might like it." Noah's eyes widened. "This is so cool. "Thank you, Colonel Henry." He looked down at Rex and added, "Thanks, Rex." Too, Rex barked once. A single, approving sound that made them all laugh. Hours passed unnoticed. They shared the cookies, passed around lukewarm cocoa from a hospital vending machine, and played a Christmas playlist on Laura's phone. The sound of "Have Yourself a Merry Little Christmas" filled the room, soft and slow. Laura looked at Henry through the glow of the bedside light. His face, lined with years and silence, seemed gentler now, not younger, but lighter, as if some invisible weight had finally begun to lift. "You look different," she said quietly. He raised an eyebrow. "Do I?" "Yes," she replied, smiling, like someone who finally came home. Henry didn't know how to answer that. He just looked down at his cup, steam curling into the air, and whispered, "Maybe I did," for the first time in a long, long while. He wasn't thinking about what he'd lost, not Margaret, not Daniel, not the years gone. All that mattered was here, the warmth of a boy's laughter, the quiet strength in a woman's eyes, and the steady rhythm of a dog's breathing at his feet. When it was time to go, Henry stood reluctantly. "I'll come by again tomorrow," he said. "Make sure they're treating you right." Laura chuckled softly. "You don't have to." He gave her a look that said otherwise. "I know." Rex nudged Noah's hand one last time before they turned to leave. At the door, Henry glanced back. The room glowed golden against the pale blue of the corridor. Laura had turned off the overhead lights, and only the small lamp by the bed remained soft, steady, like a beacon in the winter dark. For a moment, Henry stood there, taking it in, the quiet joy, the small miracle. When he finally stepped into the hall, Silent Night was playing again somewhere down the corridor, "Sleep in Heavenly Peace," the singer whispered. Henry glanced down at Rex, smiling faintly. "We did good, boy." And for the first time in many winters, as he walked out into the snow, Henry Cole felt something he hadn't known he was missing. Not victory, not duty, but peace. A year can pass quietly in a town like Snowhaven. Winters fade into springs, springs into summers, and the snow always finds its way back, as if reminding everyone that beauty often begins where silence lives. For Henry Cole, this year had been different. The hospital visits turned into coffee on Sunday mornings. The coffee became shared dinners. By summer, Laura and Noah had sold their old place across town and moved into the small cedar house just down the road from Henry's. Now, every morning, he'd see the curtains in their kitchen flutter open, the scent of Laura's baking drifting through the pines. Noah would wave on his way to school, Rex bounding after him like a guardian who refused to retire, and when Christmas returned, as it always did, Henry realized he wasn't waiting for it anymore. It had already found him. The old Cole house looked different that year. Not in furniture or decoration, but in spirit. The fire burned brighter. The tree in the corner shimmered with ornaments that didn't all match. A few were chipped, a few handmade. Noah had carved a little wooden soldier and hung it beside the silver star at the top. Laura's cinnamon candles filled the air. The sound of laughter, something that at once seemed impossible within those walls, now flowed freely from room to room. Rex lay by the hearth, half asleep, tail thumping in rhythm with Noah's giggles as the boy unspooled strings of lights. "Easy there," Henry said, pretending to scowl. "Those lights aren't combat gear. Handle them with care, soldier." Noah grinned. "Yes." Laura laughed from the kitchen. "You realize you've turned him into a cadet, right?" Henry smiled over his shoulder. "Discipline never hurt anyone." She raised an eyebrow. "Maybe not. But I think Christmas is supposed to be about joy, not formation." Henry chuckled, holding up a hand in mock surrender. "Fair point." Later that evening, when the decorating was nearly done, Noah stood on a small stool to hang one last ornament. It wasn't an ornament, really just a small wooden plaque he'd carved at school. Laura watched as he carefully tied it to a branch right at Henry's eye level. The inscription was burned into the wood, crooked but heartfelt. "For Colonel Henry, the man who waited for Christmas, and found it." For a long moment, Henry didn't speak. He just looked at it, the way the firelight danced across the letters, the way the words seemed to hum with warmth. Laura placed a gentle hand on his arm. "He wanted it to be a surprise," she said softly. Henry's throat tightened. "It is," he murmured, "the best kind." He turned to Noah, who was standing proudly, sawdust still clinging to his sweater. "Thank you, son," Henry said, and the word son slipped out so naturally that none of them even flinched. Laura blinked fast, smiling through tears. Henry crouched beside Rex, scratching behind his ear. "Looks like we did all right." "Boy," Rex answered with a soft bark, tails sweeping the floor. When the lights were finally plugged in, the whole tree came alive, gold and red, twinkling softly against the frost-glazed windows. Outside, the snow began to fall again, slow and deliberate, blanketing the world in silence. They turned off the other lights and stood together by the window, Henry, Laura, Noah, and Rex. Their reflections shimmered faintly against the glass, the glow of the tree wrapping them in warmth. The once lonely mansion, that monument to silence and memory, now pulsed with life. Henry's gaze drifted across the room. He remembered all the years he'd stood in that same spot, alone, clutching a glass of whiskey, pretending not to wait for anything. Now, that same place held laughter, and light, and the faint hum of a boy whispering to a dog about Santa Claus. Later that night, after Laura and Noah had gone next door, Henry stepped out onto the porch with Rex. The snow crunched under his boots. Above, the sky was deep and endless, dotted with stars. He looked toward the Bennett house. Through the window, he could see Noah dancing around the kitchen while Laura cleaned up, both of them still laughing. And for the first time in a long, long while, Henry didn't feel like an observer in someone else's life. He was part of it. He knelt beside Rex, his breath forming small clouds in the cold. "You know," he said softly, "I used to think Christmas was something that happened to people, that some got lucky and others didn't." Rex tilted his head. "But I was wrong," Henry continued. "It's something you give away, piece by piece, until there's nothing left to hide behind." The dog gave a small approving grunt, and Henry smiled. From somewhere down the hill, church bells began to ring slow, steady, carrying across the valley. Midnight, Christmas Day. Henry stood there a moment longer, listening. Then he whispered, "Merry Christmas, son." Maybe he was speaking to Daniel, the boy he'd once lost. Or maybe to Noah, the boy he'd found. Maybe, in some quiet way, it didn't matter anymore. The next morning, Laura and Noah joined him for breakfast. Pancakes, coffee, laughter, the kind of morning that had no reason to be remarkable except that it was. When they finished eating, Noah ran to play with Rex in the yard. Henry watched through the window as snowflakes caught in the boy's hair, and the dog bounded joyfully through the drifts. Laura stood beside him. "You look happy," she said. Henry smiled, lines deepening around his eyes. "I am." She nodded, quiet for a moment. Then she said softly, "You know, I used to think we were the ones who saved you." He looked at her, half smiling. "Maybe you were, but maybe it works both ways." Laura's eyes softened. "The gift you give," she said, finishing his thought, "is the one that saves you." Henry chuckled. "Smart woman." Outside, Noah shouted with laughter as Rex rolled in the snow. The sun rose higher, painting the snow-covered roofs in gold. Inside the coal house, the tree lights flickered against the window pane, casting warm reflections across the walls. For the first time in decades, the house felt like a home, not a fortress of memory, but a place where life continued. And as the bells in Snow Haven rang again through the crisp winter air, Henry Cole knew one simple truth. He hadn't found Christmas. He had become it.